Hey, everybody. Today we're going to talk about persuasive writing and introduce you to rhetoric and persuasion. So, what is rhetoric? What is it? Well, really, rhetoric just means the art of effective or persuasive speaking and writing. Okay. We'll talk about the use of figures of speech and other kind of techniques to improve our arguments later. But really, what you need to know is that rhetoric means persuasion. So it's an art, as I said before, and it takes some skills to kind of develop. Some people are naturally better at it than others. They just have tendencies or abilities and talents towards argument, but they can be developed in everybody. So why does that even matter? Well, our class focuses on persuasive writing, and this is also the type of writing you'll need to do on the writing SOL. However, it's really important to know how to make your case and defend yourself in life anyway. So doing this and learning about this is going to be important not just for our class, but outside of class as well. So Aristotle was the first one who outlined the rules or purposes of rhetoric. He was an ancient Greek philosopher, lived during the late 300s BC. And he noted that there were four purposes of rhetoric or persuasion. The first one is to enable the speaker to make a case for what is right or just. Number two is to create relevance or produce conviction in an audience. So you might want something from a group of people, but they don't see it as being relevant. So before I can argue a case about why we need to save the bees, I have to tell you why it matters. I have to make you care about it. That's one of the things rhetoric is used for. It's also used to explore both sides of an argument to seek out truth or establish justice, such as what we do in our justice system and in courts, what lawyers would do in a courtroom. And also, probably most importantly to you personally, and what you would use throughout your life is to defend yourself or your position. And not just think of that as a defensive, as in if I'm in trouble. I mean simply to support any idea or opinion that you believe to be true. So Aristotle said that the job of rhetoric, and remember, rhetoric means persuasion, is to explore and discover truth in the absence of specialized knowledge by exploring all the possibilities and alternatives. So what does he mean by that? So we get the easy part about, well, it's supposed to explore and discover truth. But what does he mean by in the absence of specialized knowledge? Well, that just means I'm not an expert. So he says that we use rhetoric and persuasion to persuade people of our ideas when they're not experts. It's really that simple. So what's really cool about rhetoric and persuasion is that it challenges what is considered to be truth or certainty, both culturally and personally. So this is a big thing to think about. A lot of people use the words fact and truth interchangeably, but they are not the same thing, right? Facts don't change. Truths change over time. Now you're probably thinking they're going, no, truths don't change over time, but they do. Facts are judgment and value free. Truths are seldom judgment or value free. So let's talk about and explore that for just a minute before we go to the next slide. So truth, just to show you that truth changes, let's consider this. About 150 some years ago, it was a cultural truth that African American people were only 2/3 human. That was a legal certainty. That was on the books. It was a law, the 2/3 rule, right? We've studied that in history. That was a truth, quote unquote. 500 years ago, it was a scientific, quote unquote, truth that the world was flat and that the sun actually revolved around the earth and not the other way around. So this is what I mean about truth changing. And we hear the talk about people saying, oh, my truth and your truth, and they're different. Of course they're different because they're not fact. Truth is about experience and context. Fact is about what is observed. So we would use facts to back up our personal truths. Rhetoric is all about me trying to make my truth your truth. I want you to believe what I believe, and I would use facts and evidence to support my claims. So if you take anything away from this slide, take away the fact that truth and fact are not interchangeable words. So for rhetoric to happen, we have to have a rhetorical situation, which is comprised of a speaker, the subject and the topic, and the audience. So if any one of these things is missing, we do not have a rhetorical situation. So if I have a speaker all ready to go and going to talk about their subject or topic with passion and emphasis, but there's no audience, then there's no rhetorical situation. If there's an audience and a topic to be discussed, but no one to talk about it, there's no rhetorical situation. So rhetorical situation just means when and where I argue a case or I argue a point. And remember too, be careful with the word argue and defend, because we're not talking about when someone's in trouble or negative feelings necessarily. We're just talking about defending a claim or supporting a claim. So we have this little triangle of rhetoric, and that rhetoric triangle represents all aspects of a rhetorical situation that must be present. So the writer or speaker must take into account all of these things before they produce their argument. Okay, for example, let's say that I need $100 to buy a new pair of sneakers and I don't have that money. So I have to consider my audience. Who am I going to ask for that money? Well, one, I'm going to be smart. I'm going to ask the parent or grandparent that's more likely to say yes, right? That's an example of considering an audience. You also need to understand what your audience wants to hear from you or what they might say to you in response. So again, that's just one example of how you must take into consideration the topic, the audience, the place and time of the argument. So the word rhetoric just comes from the word speaker, and it was originally focused on oral speech. It developed as a result of democracy because here we're all voting. Now there's a new need to persuade people of what they should vote for. So things we consider when using rhetoric, or remember persuading, are kairos. That's a nice Greek word. It just means occasion or place, and they're all public forums. So kairos is just the occasion or place, and those are political, forensic, which means legal, or ceremonial. So we all know about political rhetoric because we watch it all the time in the debates. Legal would be things like what you see in the courtroom. And then ceremonial rhetoric would be things like eulogies or perhaps speeches like I have a dream. And anything that's not overtly political would be considered a ceremonial use of rhetoric. So the other thing we consider is exigence or timeliness, meaning is it important? Is it relevant? Is it urgent? We only argue what matters, right? We also get very irritated with our friends when we feel like they're arguing about something that doesn't matter, right? Like it's just a waste of time. So rhetoric is the same. You'd only use rhetoric and persuasion with topics that matter or are relevant. So we're not going to argue whether or not African Americans are 100% human beings or 2/3% human beings, because that has already been determined. Supreme Court determined that the 2/3 rule was absolutely wrong and that they are 100% human, just like the rest of us. So that would be irrelevant. That's not something we would argue. That's not timely. So nor would we argue something that is so far off in the future, it doesn't even matter yet. So we're not going to argue about what the best modes of transportation for human colonization on Mars are, because we can't even go to Mars yet. We can't even take a manned space shuttle to Mars. So that again is not relevant either. So we're looking for something that is urgent and timely now. So things that have already been determined in the past or things that are way too far off in the future are not so much timely or exigent as topics that are going on in the context of where we are now. Now, that is not to say that we can't go backward and look at something that needs to be changed. That's not what I mean by exigence. Exigence just means, is it relevant right now? So you guys should be familiar with these persuasive techniques. We have ethos, pathos, and logos. And these are the three different ways a speaker or a writer appeals to their audience. Okay, and again, you would choose based on your audience, right? So ethos, which is the most misunderstood of all three, is not about the audience. Ethos is about the speaker. Ethos is about the speaker's credibility. Can you believe what this person is saying? So that's developed through their ethics, belief system, their character, the way they speak, sometimes their job. So people who are doctors automatically have ethos when it comes to talking about health, right? So I have ethos when it comes to talking about English. You pretty much trust that I know what I'm talking about. I have credibility. But some people, you actually have to listen to what they're saying before you can determine if they're credible. So ethos is about the speaker, not the audience. It's not about the belief systems of the audience. If I am going to appeal to your belief system and your morals, that's actually pathos. So ethos is when the speaker develops credibility. Let's go ahead and talk about pathos since I just brought that up. Pathos is an appeal to the emotions, right? So this is when I'm appealing to your feels. This is when the ASPCA commercial comes on television showing all the animals and playing Sarah McLachlan songs, and you just want to scream at them and say, take my money, and throw all your money at them because it appeals to your emotions. And emotions often make people make decisions. They're often the driving factor. Now, the second part about pathos that a lot of people don't really understand is that pathos isn't just about appealing to my emotions. It's about putting me in the right frame of mind to hear your argument. Okay. So let's go back to that $100 for shoes thing. And you decided that mom is actually the better person to ask. So you're going to clean up the kitchen and get it ready. And you have a nice cup of tea for her when she walks in the door because you want her to be more receptive to your argument. That's what an introduction is all about. An introduction is pathos. It prepares your reader for your argument. So when you make that tea and you clean up that kitchen and you get her favorite book out for her to read, anything like that, you're putting her in the right frame of mind to hear your argument. That is also pathos, and it is crucial. Sometimes putting your audience in the right frame of mind is about giving them important information they need to know to hear your argument. So pathos relies on both aspects of appealing to emotion, not just appealing to your feelings and making you possibly agree based on the fact that you feel a way about something, but also about preparing you to hear an argument and making you more receptive to believing it. So logos, we all know, is about logic and reason, and it challenges assumptions using logic and reason. So there's two types of this type of persuasive technique: inductive and deductive. So inductive reasoning is when you argue by example. This is like what we do in writing. We present a thesis and then we give you examples to support that conclusion. Deductive works the other way. Deductive is when I begin with the evidence and sort of trail into a conclusion based on what there is there. It's kind of like what a police officer does when he is solving a crime. They find the clues and then they put it together at the end. So inductive and deductive. We're going to be doing inductive mostly in this class. There is such a thing as arguing by implied thesis, where you never actually come out and say your thesis, but you do such a good job proving it that people understand that's what you were trying to do. We really don't want to do that in this course, or especially on any standardized testing, SAT, ACT, SOL, any of those things, because if you do not have an outright thesis, they will dock you. So we're going to use inductive reasoning, which is argument by example. So rhetoric occurs at all registers of speech. A register of speech is just the level of formality you're using in your writing or your speaking. So before we talk about that, let's talk about why it even matters. Like, why does register matter? Your language is an integral part of your argument. It must be appropriate for the time, place, and audience. And for our class, we will be writing in formal register. Okay, but I'm hoping that we can conduct class in a consultative register. But when we write, it needs to be formal. Okay, we can't use texting language. We can't write the way we speak to our buddies. There's nothing wrong with that when you speak to your buddies. But when we're in a different time and place, we can't speak or write like that. So when you're writing to your buddies using your texting, or your parents or anybody else texting, that's at a casual level. If you're texting somebody and they have your phone number, that's in a casual level of speech. Okay. Email, you may not have someone's number, which means it has to bump up a level of formality. Okay. And then again, depending on how well you know the person, it might bump up again. So register matters. Your formality of speech matters, because people aren't going to take your argument seriously if you're talking to them the way you would talk to your buddy at lunch. Right? That's not going to fly. So let's talk about the highest level of formality. This is called the frozen or static register. And really, it's a very small amount of things. This is a printed language that does not change, meaning we say it the same way each and every time we say it. So an example of frozen or static language is the Pledge of Allegiance. So that is said exactly the same way each and every time it is recited. Okay, the oath of office for the President of the United States is another example of that, or for any public official, in fact. The wording is always the same. Okay, marriage vows, depending on your denomination, that's pretty much the same. Frozen static language in Latin, usually for presenting Mass. All of those are said the exact same way each and every time. There's very little of that actually occurs in the real world. So formal register is the next level. And this is a type of speech where it's one-way participation, meaning it's not I talk and then you talk back. It's one-way participation, and you have to be sure to give technical vocab and exact definitions. You must present background knowledge, because that's not going to be known and maybe not even be able to be inferred. So this would be things like presentations or introductions of people, places, or things. So presentation, like your writing or your argument, this would be formal. So think of what the lawyers would say in a courtroom. That's not two-way, right? They speak to the jury. The jury doesn't speak back, right? So formal is the register we want to use, where we're using formal language, we're using correct spellings, punctuations, usage, and we would review to make sure those things are correct before we submit. Consultative, this is two-way participation. So this is what I'm hoping we can do in class, where I provide some background information to you, but prior knowledge could exist. I don't necessarily assume you know something, but there may be some prior knowledge. And something called back channeling is allowed. Back channeling going, those are examples of back channeling. We would not want to do that in formal speech. So if you were speaking to the president or giving an address or somebody important in the audience, you would definitely not be wanting to say things like, like that. And right. Those are things that are okay in consultative speech, but we would not want to do that in formal speech. Obviously, back channeling doesn't occur in writing. Excuse me. And other interruptions in consultative speech are allowed. So this would be like when you say, Ms. Copen, but what about informal speech when? Like you would be allowed to interrupt that type of situation because it's not as formal. You would not interrupt the principal while she's speaking about something or giving a presentation. You would not interrupt a student peer who's giving a presentation, right? That's a little more formal. So casual occurs in groups with friends and acquaintances, and there's really no background information necessary at all because you're all in the know, right? You're all in the circle. So when someone gives you that side look and you're like, yep, that's exactly what I was thinking. And you don't necessarily need to know the background information about something because it's either implied or you already know the information because it's part of the group. So somebody might come in and you say something and a bunch of people chuckle and that person's like, what? So they would not be in group and they would not necessarily understand. Here, interruptions and slang are common and accepted. All right, so this is like your texting language, and you would definitely not want this in your formal. You would not want to use slang or cliches or jokes in your formal writing or speech. The last register is called intimate, which is often misunderstood as well, because it doesn't just mean like love between, husbands and wives, or, boyfriends and girlfriends. It's not about that. It just means it's non-public, meaning this is the way you communicate between people who you are very close to. And here, intonation of your voice, the way you say things, is more important than the wording or the grammar. Okay. And this would also include very strong nonverbal messages. So you can have intimate register with your BFF. Like I know I can look at my best friend across the room and just make a face, and she knows exactly what I'm thinking. Like I don't even have to say a word, and she understands. So intimate can mean between siblings, especially twins. Sometimes twins have their own little language. Intimate can be between parents and children. It doesn't necessarily mean husband-wife type of intimacy. That's not what it means. It just means very close, non-public relationship. So a relationship you have outside of the public eye as well. So we definitely do not want to be writing in that level. So we definitely want to stick to a formal register when we write. So some of you guys like to have notes in terms of presentations as well. So if you would like a nice set of Cornell notes like this that you can go and highlight ideas in, you can click on this link in the tab. And you can also print them if you want, or if you would like to actually annotate them, you can use these directions and use DocHub to annotate them. All right, guys, thanks for taking this review with me of rhetoric and persuasion. And remember, rhetoric equals persuasion, but fact does not equal truth.